For 9 straight years, every Thursday morning without exception, a white refrigerated truck from Hargrove Foods pulled up behind the same narrow diner on the edge of Millhaven, Pennsylvania, and unloaded another crate of rejected product: bread loaves with slight burns, soup cans with dented lids, boxed pasta with torn labels, cases of cooking oil that suppliers had already marked unsellable. No phone call ahead, no explanation attached. Just a handwritten work order, a tight turnaround, and the unspoken expectation that Wesley Pruett would figure something out before the weekend rush. Wesley never complained. He signed the work orders, stacked the crates in his walk-in, and got to work. That was the arrangement, not a partnership, not a contract negotiated between equals, just a quietly understood transaction. Hargrove disposed of its problem inventory, Wesley received a modest processing fee, and somewhere in a glass office 40 miles north, the woman running one of the largest regional food distribution companies in Pennsylvania never once thought about the man making her waste disappear. Then one Thursday, the truck didn't come. Instead, a black company sedan pulled up outside Wesley's diner at 7 in the morning, and Hargrove Foods CEO Diane Calloway stepped out onto the cracked sidewalk wearing a blazer that probably cost more than Wesley's monthly utility bill. She had the look of someone who hadn't slept in 3 days and didn't want anyone to know it. Wesley Pruett was 44 years old, medium build, graying at the temples in the way that happens faster when you're raising a child alone and running a kitchen that never fully closes. His hands were always slightly rough, from dish soap, from prep work, from the particular kind of tired that doesn't go away with one good night's sleep. He'd been cooking professionally since he was 19. First in other people's kitchens, then eventually in his own. The diner was called Bluestone, named for the color of the countertops his late wife, Patricia, had picked out the year they opened together. She'd stood in the tile showroom for 45 minutes, deliberating between 2 nearly identical shades of blue-gray, before settling on the one she said had more soul. Wesley hadn't changed them since. He wasn't sure he ever would. Patricia died 6 years before Diane Calloway showed up at his door. Pancreatic cancer, fast and relentless. 11 months from diagnosis to the end. Their daughter Audrey was 8 when it happened. She was 14 now, old enough to notice when her father was exhausted, young enough to still believe he always had things under control. Wesley had built the years since Patricia's death around 2 anchors: Audrey's school schedule and Bluestone's kitchen. Everything else orbited those 2 fixed points. There were no vacations, no sick days, no fallback. Just the work, the routine, and the quiet discipline of a man who had learned that forward motion was the only grief that didn't eat you alive. Bluestone wasn't impressive from the outside. 11 tables, a counter with 8 stools, a kitchen visible through a pass-through window that regulars liked because it made the place feel honest. The neighborhood around it had been slowly hollowing out for years, as bigger chains moved into the commercial strip 2 miles east. But Wesley's lunch service still drew a steady crowd: construction workers, teachers from the middle school, a rotating group of retired men who came more for the coffee and company than the food. What most of them didn't know was that about a third of Bluestone's operational costs were quietly subsidized by those Thursday deliveries from Hargrove. It had started almost accidentally. A Hargrove regional logistics manager had eaten at Bluestone twice, and mentioned offhand that the company was throwing away significant inventory every week due to minor packaging defects. Product perfectly safe to use, just unsellable through normal retail channels. Wesley had offered to take it at a reduced processing fee. The manager had agreed. A simple arrangement between 2 practical people. Over 9 years, the arrangement had quietly scaled. Wesley had gotten extraordinarily good at turning Hargrove's discards into something. Soup bases from dented cans, bread pudding from overbaked loaves, fresh pasta rolled by hand when the boxed kind arrived in unusable condition. He had developed an almost intuitive sense for what could be rescued, and how, for what combination of technique and creativity, could transform as liability into a meal someone would actually remember. His regulars sometimes joked that the specials board at Bluestone changed more than the weather. What they didn't know was that the specials were largely driven by whatever Hargrove had sent that week. Wesley had become, without anyone formally acknowledging it, one of the most creative and resourceful food recovery operations in the region. He'd quietly saved Hargrove tens of thousands of dollars in disposal costs. He'd also fed hundreds of people in a neighborhood that needed it. Hargrove's accounting department knew the number. Diane Calloway did not. At 39, Diane was considered a sharp operator in regional food distribution, competitive, data-driven, precise. She'd taken over Hargrove from her father 3 years earlier, and immediately expanded aggressively. New distribution contracts, new warehouse partnerships, a significant push into specialty grocery. Industry publications ran favorable profiles. Her expansion strategy was treated as a case study in calculated risk. But fast expansion has a way of creating blind spots. New contracts had been signed without adequate supplier vetting. A warehouse partnership in Western Ohio had concealed significant food safety violations. A specialty product line had been sourced from a supplier who turned out to be falsifying organic certifications. 3 things failing at nearly the same time. The FDA investigation began in February. By March, 2 major grocery chains had suspended their Hargrove contracts, pending review. By April, the company's credit line was under pressure, and 2 senior executives had resigned quietly, framing their departures as personal decisions. By early May, Diane was doing something she hadn't done in years, going through the details herself, not delegating, not reviewing summaries, actually reading the operational files. That was when she found the Bluestone account. 9 years of Thursday deliveries. Processing fees that were, in retrospect, embarrassingly low, and attached to the file, a handwritten note from the logistics manager, who'd set up the arrangement originally, retired now for 3 years. This one's different. Wesley Pruett doesn't just dispose of the product, he actually uses it, worth knowing. Diane had read the note twice, then she'd looked up the diner's address, and driven there herself. She walked into Bluestone at 7:04 on a Thursday morning, 40 minutes before the kitchen officially opened. The front door was unlocked because Wesley was already inside, prepping for the day. He looked up from a cutting board where he was breaking down a case of slightly soft tomatoes, not from Hargrove, just from a local produce supplier, having a rough week. His expression when he recognized her was complicated in a way that was hard to read quickly. Not hostile, not warm, careful. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Mr. Pruett," she said, "I apologize for coming without calling ahead." "The truck didn't come this morning," he said, not an accusation, just a fact on the table. "No," she said, "it didn't." There was a short silence. Through the pass-through window, the kitchen smelled of coffee and onions and the particular deep warmth of a space that has been used consistently for a long time. "My daughter comes in around 8 to help set up before school," Wesley said. "Whatever you need to say, I'd prefer we keep it to before then." Diane nodded. She pulled out the stool closest to the counter, sat down without being invited, and told him the truth. Not the polished version, the actual version. Hargrove was in serious trouble. The FDA situation was worse than what had been made public. 2 major contracts were suspended indefinitely. A third was in active renegotiation. The company's legal exposure was significant and growing. The board was divided on whether to pursue a structured sale, a merger, or attempt to rebuild independently. She was running out of runway, and somewhere in the middle of crisis management, she had found his file, and realized, with the particular sting of a person who prided herself on knowing her business, that she had no idea what he actually did. Wesley listened without interrupting. He kept his hands on the cutting board, not working, just resting there. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What do you want from me?" he asked, honestly. Diane said, "I wanted to understand what you've been doing with the product. Because when I ran the numbers on what we've sent you over 9 years, versus what it would have cost us to dispose of it properly, you've saved this company somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000 in verified disposal fees alone. Not counting the liability reduction from keeping that material out of landfill documentation. And I didn't know your name 3 weeks ago." Wesley looked at her steadily. "You knew the account number?" "Yes," she said, "I knew the account number." Another pause. From somewhere in the back a timer went off, and Wesley moved without thinking to silence it, checked something in the oven, returned. "The tomatoes I'm cutting right now," he said, "came from Lester Briggs's farm on Route 9. He had a temperature problem in his cold storage last week, and half his inventory went soft. Not rotten, just soft. Grocery stores won't take them. I'm making a roasted tomato sauce that'll be on the menu for the next 4 days and, It'll be the best thing on the board." He paused. "The bread you sent me 2 weeks ago had mold on 3 loaves out of 40. I pulled those. The other 37 became the base for a bread pudding that sold out in 2 hours on Sunday." Diane was quiet. "I don't know what your crisis looks like from where you're sitting," Wesley continued. "But most of what you've been sending me isn't broken, it's just inconvenient. There's a difference." Diane Calloway had sat across from federal investigators, hostile board members, and aggressive attorneys over the past 3 months. Something about this particular conversation was harder than all of them. Maybe because Wesley wasn't performing, he wasn't angry, wasn't looking for leverage, wasn't trying to protect himself. He was just telling her something true. She asked if she could come back. Not that day. Audrey was due in 20 minutes, and he'd been clear about that, but another time. To understand better what he was doing and how. He said she could, not warmly, but honestly. Over the following 2 weeks, Diane returned to Bluestone 3 times. She came during off hours, sat at the counter with coffee, and watched Wesley work. She asked questions, he answered them without fanfare. What she said was not what she expected. She had assumed, in the vague way that executives sometimes carry, assumptions about small operations, that Bluestone was a modest but unremarkable neighborhood diner. What she found instead was a kitchen run with a level of intentionality that most restaurant consultants would have charged significant money to teach. Wesley tracked every incoming product, its condition, and its potential use, before a single decision was made. He maintained a mental taxonomy of techniques. What could be frozen, and for how long, what needed immediate processing, what required transformation before it became usable, what was genuinely beyond saving. He had developed, through 9 years of working with damaged and imperfect product, a skill set that combined classical training with something that could only be described as wisdom about waste. He also, she noticed, ran his kitchen around a schedule that never conflicted with Audrey's. Drop off at 7:45. Pick up at 3:15, unless she had track practice, in which case 5. The kitchen staff, 2 part-time cooks and a dishwasher, knew the schedule and worked around it without being asked. Not because Wesley demanded it explicitly, but because the rhythm of the place had been built around it for years. On the second visit, Audrey came in after school and sat in the corner booth doing homework while her father finished the dinner prep. She was polite and unsurprised by the visitor and went back to her textbook without particular ceremony. Diane watched Wesley move between the kitchen and the dining room, checking in on his daughter once every 20 minutes. In a way that was casual and constant at the same time. The particular background attention of a parent who has learned to parent and works simultaneously without either one suffering. It affected her in a way that took her a day to fully articulate to herself. She had spent 3 years running a company that moved millions of pounds of food annually. She had never once thought seriously about what happened to the fraction that didn't make it through the system cleanly. It was a line item, a disposal cost, a regulatory headache. To Wesley, it was material, it was potential, it was a meal. On the third visit she made him an offer. Not charity, and not the vague promise of a larger contract, a specific proposal. Hargrove would formalize the relationship with a proper food recovery partnership agreement, providing consistent volume, reasonable lead time, and a processing fee that actually reflected market rate. In exchange, Wesley would help Hargrove design a broader food recovery protocol, documentation, categorization, handling guidance, that could be presented to their grocery partners as a concrete sustainability initiative, something real, not a press release. Hargrove needed demonstrable goodwill with its partners right now. A verifiable, functional food recovery program, one that had been running for 9 years already, quietly, without anyone asking for credit, was exactly the kind of substantive story that could help rebuild trust. Wesley read the proposal she'd printed out. He read it twice, which she was beginning to understand was something he did with most things. The fee structure is fair, he said. The timeline on delivery notification needs to change. I need 48 hours minimum, not 24, if you want me to plan properly. And I want it in writing that Audrey's school pickup is never a scheduling conflict. Diane blinked at the last condition. That's, yes. Of course, people say of course and then forget, Wesley said. Not unkindly, just accurately. She wrote it into the agreement herself, by hand at his counter. He initialed it, The Hargrove situation did not resolve quickly or cleanly. Federal investigations rarely do. 2 executives eventually faced personal fines. One supplier partnership was terminated permanently. The specialty product line was discontinued. The company's reputation took a genuine hit that advertising couldn't paper over. But Hargrove survived. Not perfectly, and not without lasting scars. It survived because Diane made the decision, eventually, to stop expanding into territory she didn't understand and start paying attention to the operational foundations that were actually working. The food recovery program was one of the first things she pointed to when explaining the company's path forward. Auditors and grocery partners visited Bluestone 3 times in the months that followed. They all left with the same vaguely humbled expression. Wesley was offered a formal advisory role with Hargrove's operations team. Not a title he'd ever imagined, but one that came with real influence, and a schedule built around his life rather than the other way around. He accepted after reading the full contract, asking 4 specific questions, and confirming, in writing, that the role would never require him to miss a school event. Audrey found out about it on a Tuesday evening when Wesley mentioned it casually over dinner. She looked up from her pasta and said, "Wait, the big food company?" "The big food company," Wesley confirmed. "Did you tell them what you told me? About the tomatoes?" "Something like that." She thought about this. "Good," she said, and went back to her pasta. Things changed after that, though not dramatically. Bluestone stayed small. Wesley kept his 11 tables and his 8 counter stools and the bluestone countertops that Patricia had spent 45 minutes choosing in a tile showroom in 2009. The specials board still changed based on what came through the door, the retired men still came for the coffee, the lunch crowd still included teachers from the middle school, who had never once been told that the soup they were eating had started as a case of dented cans. But Thursday mornings were different. The refrigerated truck still came. Now with 48 hours notice, now with a manifest attached that actually told Wesley what he was working with. A logistics coordinator at Hargrove had been assigned specifically to the Bluestone account. Her name was Marta, and she called Wesley every Wednesday to go through the week's incoming inventory together. Wesley's processing fee increased to something that reflected what he'd actually been doing all along. Nobody at Hargrove brought this up without visible discomfort. Diane Calloway still drove down to Millhaven occasionally. Not for meetings, not for deliveries. She'd come in on a slow afternoon, sit at the counter, order whatever was on the specials board, and talk about the industry, about the recovery program, about whatever was on Diane's mind. Wesley wasn't her friend exactly, not yet. But he was something. The kind of person whose opinion she found herself actually wanting, rather than seeking out strategically. One afternoon she asked him, somewhat indirectly, why he hadn't been angrier when she walked in that first Thursday morning. Most people in his position, she said, would have had something pointed to say. Wesley was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet before he said something he'd actually thought about. "I had plenty to say," he told her, "but Audrey was coming in at 8, and I've found that most things worth saying don't need to be said in anger to land." Diane looked at the bluestone countertops, the slight variation in tone across them, the places where the finish had worn softer from years of use. "Your wife picked those out," she said. She'd heard the story from one of the regulars on her second visit. "She did," Wesley said. "She said this one had more soul." Diane nodded slowly. She didn't say anything else for a while. She didn't need to. There's a version of this kind of story where the lesson is simple. Do good work, and eventually someone important will notice. That version is clean and reassuring and not entirely honest. The truth is that Wesley Pruett did extraordinary work for 9 years and nobody important noticed. The arrangement continued because it was convenient for Hargrove, not because anyone was paying attention to the person making it work. He was an account number, a disposal solution, a line item on a logistics spreadsheet. What changed wasn't that Hargrove finally recognized his value. What changed was that Hargrove ran out of other options and had to look more carefully at what it actually had. That's the part nobody puts on a motivational poster. But here's what's also true. When the moment came, Wesley's 9 years of consistent, unglamorous, genuinely excellent work meant that the answer was already there, fully formed, proven, undeniable. He didn't have to argue for his worth, he just had to let them look. Some people carry a company without ever being given a title. Most of the time, that goes unnoticed and unrewarded, and that's a real failure. Of institutions, of leadership, of the systems that are supposed to see people clearly. But occasionally, the weight becomes visible. And whoever's been carrying it quietly finds that they've been building something stronger than anyone realized. Wesley Pruett knew that. He'd known it for a while, he just hadn't had anyone to tell it to, until now.